Hey everyone, today's story is about a healer with a forbidden ability called Dark Heal. After losing his freedom because of war, he decides to leave humanity behind and escape to the Demon Kingdom. But what he finds there isn't danger. It's the perfect place for his skills. So with that said, let's begin the story. Everyone called him the Devil's Child. The matron at the orphanage, the church priests, and even the neighborhood children. The moment their eyes met his, their faces would contort. Unlike the holy power bestowed upon humans, this wicked gift was usually found only in demons. The young Kiwi Araya possessed magical power. The boy wandered through the forest, looking for someone on whom he could test his gift, until he spotted a small black monster, with a wound on its back, many legs, 2 pairs of eyes, and a huge, toothy mouth. Araya approached, grabbed it by the arm, and his eyes flashing, cast a spell. A white flame engulfed the monster. It began to squeak and staggered slightly. And in the next second, it became normal, and then it quickly ran away. Araya looked at the result and chuckled to himself, because everything had worked out just as it should. He waved goodbye to the monster and, tucking the book under his arm, muttered under his breath that even though he'd picked up this old junk in the trash, the little thing was quite effective. Then he settled down on the roots of one of the trees, crossing his ankles, and began flipping through the pages. He had simply replaced the holy power with a magical formula for holy healing from page 320. But the reproduction was excellent, and now he needed to work on his speed. The young man looked around intently and rubbed his eyes with his fist. And he continued flipping through the pages, thinking that if he truly mastered this power and found the right use for it, he could make a ton of money and buy as many books as he wanted. At this thought, his eyes sparkled brightly. And so, without even realizing it, the boy took his first step toward becoming a legend. A few years later, in a house in an ordinary town, the main character sat with a cup of coffee, intently reading a newspaper. A month had passed since the war began with the northern neighbor. The demon country of Vogron, and the human state, the kingdom of Rue Humanior, held an overwhelming advantage. Araya studied the newspaper with dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep. It reported that the capture of the western lands of the elves was imminent, and he snorted, because such news did not impress him. The lady who had been visiting him for 10 years since the clinic opened seemed to be connected to the military as well. As for Peepo, who had been left for observation, he could be released right after lunch. All that remained was to quickly palpate him. He was snapped out of his thoughts by the twitching of one of the monster's tentacles, the one that had warned the visitors, and the young man jumped up with his eyebrows raised in surprise. Could it be an emergency patient? However, standing in the doorway was Lieutenant Colonel Yakov Schwiesen with several soldiers behind him, and frowning, he asked if the dark healer Kiwi Araya was the one standing before him. The protagonist nodded and opened the door, and the lieutenant colonel immediately announced that war was underway, that the time had come to fulfill his duty to the kingdom, and that he should be grateful the army had even sent him a summons. Araya objected that the situation didn't seem critical and asked why they were sending an ordinary civilian to war at all. But Yakov wasn't listening anymore. He burst into the room, throwing out as he went that, among other things, the guy was suspected of heresy. The protagonist snapped his head up and tried to stop the soldiers, saying he hadn't done anything illegal, but Schwiesen shook his head. He wasn't obligated to explain, so he'd better not do anything stupid while they searched the building. While his subordinates rummaged through the rooms and records, the lieutenant colonel himself paced the room and, upon entering the far room, grimaced. A clinic for monsters in an upscale neighborhood, and how on earth were they still allowed to operate? Araya turned away and remarked that it was precisely because there were almost no competitors that monsters flocked to him. At that, Schwiesen folded his arms across his chest and asked, "So, it's all about the money?" Araya nodded, but he added with a smirk that it wasn't just that. A person with a natural gift for magic would be hated anyway, so wasn't it logical to use those strengths to survive? The lieutenant colonel gripped the pistol's handle more tightly in its holster on his hip and noted that he'd heard plenty of stories about how there were plenty of oddballs among magicians. But Araya seemed to be a unique specimen. The young man watched the soldier's movements closely while Yakov walked around the room once more, taking a few steps. And then he flung open the door at the far end. He drew his pistol and fired several shots. Araya snapped out of his stupor, stumbled forward, and asked what was going on. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Schwiesen, staring at the monster's twitching body, announced loudly. Just as he'd suspected, Kiwi Araya had been harboring a monster, which meant he was a heretic. The law prohibiting the harboring of demons and monsters had been violated, and ignorance of the law was no excuse. The protagonist froze in the doorway, staring at the bleeding monster and thinking that he hadn't heard of any such law at all. There had been nothing in the newspapers. One of the soldiers exclaimed that it was no surprise. The law had only gone into effect this morning and hadn't been announced anywhere yet. Araya frowned. Wait a minute. So, it was all a setup. The sudden summons, the clinic's closure, the heresy charge, all links in the same chain. And now he was dancing to the tune of a script written by someone he didn't even know. The author of this script is likely sitting high up in the royal army. Without looking up, he walked into the room and pushed aside one of the soldiers' rifles with his hand. The soldier shouted after him to keep it clean. Araya took a towel, adjusted his cuffs, pulled a white coat over it, and gave a grim smile. The lieutenant colonel had no authority to take the law into his own hands, which meant they couldn't shoot him. He looked at the soldiers and said that this was just a routine procedure. Of the 3 bullets, 2 had passed through, 1 remained. He stepped closer, peered intently into the entry wound, and muttered that the bullet was probably lodged in an internal organ or a bone. Then he put his hand to his chin and grinned. The situation was more or less clear. The next second, Araya was already next to the monster. He jumped up, placed his hand on it, and closed his eyes. Spells came one after another, almost without pause, scanning for internal damage, analyzing anatomy, the location of organs and blood vessels, detection of a foreign object, a bullet lodged in the abdominal cavity, then stimulation of immune function, repair of damage in parallel with stimulation of peristalsis to push the projectile out, and finally acceleration of natural regeneration to close the entry wound. All this took no more than 5 minutes. Yet with each new spell, the glow emanating from the protagonist's hands, a cold white light spread through the dark room, casting sharp shadows on the walls and the faces of the soldiers frozen in the doorway. The lieutenant colonel and his men watched silently, not moving from their spots. When it was all over, Araya exhaled heavily and muttered that that was it. And then, even more quietly, he added that the monster should get out. A second later, the creature, still covered in drying blood, leaped to its feet and dashed toward the open door. The soldiers didn't even have time to react and watched it go with bewildered looks. Yakov watched the whole scene, then exclaimed that Araya had healed a mortally wounded man in just a couple of minutes, sighed heavily, and scratched his head. And he muttered gloomily, "To let a monster get away. Does he even realize what he's done?" The protagonist looked at the soldiers and thought about how he was forced to play by the army's script. But he was a dark healer, and his task was to treat patients, saving them from death, regardless of who or what ordered him to do so. Glancing over his shoulder, he sighed and said aloud that it was just a job and nothing personal. And in his mind, he added that this was his act of protest, however small. Then he held out his hand and calmly stated that one soldier owed him exactly 12,000 mani. Looking at their frozen faces, he continued, "This was the fee for the emergency surgery required because of their carelessness, and he wanted to receive the entire amount in person, right now." The next second, the lieutenant colonel was standing right next to him, so enraged that it was evident in every movement. He struck the young man hard, and he shouted at him not to get cocky, because he was a heretic who dared to mention money at a time like this, and clearly had no idea what kind of situation he was in. Araya lay on the floor with a broken nose, thinking that he had counted on the fact that since they needed him, they wouldn't touch him. But it seemed he had miscalculated this time. After calming down a bit, Shuizhen said that Kiwi Araya had been declared a heretic and stripped of all civil rights. If they wanted, they could hand him over to the Inquisition or even execute him. Araya looked up at him and asked what was expected of him. The lieutenant colonel explained. From now on, the young man was at the disposal of the royal army and would be stationed in one of the cities. Army intelligence gathers information by interrogating captured demons, and he would assist in that process. At these words, the protagonist's eyes widened, and he wondered, heal? Enemy demons? Are they serious? Shuizhen gave a grim smile, looking like someone who was clearly enjoying the situation, and explained, with a dark healer on hand, they would be able to torture the demons much more brutally and for much longer, since the demons wouldn't die prematurely, and gathering information would be far more productive. Hearing this, Araya frowned and thought that these soldiers and the kingdom itself were far more terrifying than any demons. As if reading his thoughts, Lieutenant Colonel Yakov stepped forward, grabbed the dark healer by the hair, and yanked him toward him, then ordered him to choose, obey and live, or side with the demons and go to the block. Araya paused for a second, gave the man holding him a grim look, and said he understood. He would obey the intelligence directorate's order. Hearing the answer he wanted, the lieutenant colonel let go of his hair and added with a nasty smirk that it was a wise decision, but he shouldn't even hope to return to this city, and to go back to making a living in the kingdom. There was no place for him here anymore. A second later, the front door slammed shut, and the protagonist was left alone. He rubbed his bruised cheekbone, exhaled heavily, and muttered under his breath that he was in deep trouble. They're forcing him to participate in torture, and after the war, he won't be able to return to the clinic anyway. There's no money to be made in dark healing in this kingdom anymore. These thoughts nearly drove him mad. He covered his face with his hands and groaned aloud that this was the end of his career. And then something clicked. He opened his eyes, stared at the ceiling, and said resolutely out loud, "That's it. He was leaving this kingdom." But he couldn't just run away. He needed a place that would take him in. Araya slammed his fist into his palm. His eyes flashed, and the decision finally fell into place. He would emigrate. And there is exactly one country where he would definitely be useful. The demon realm of Ugron, with which the kingdom of Ruhumanier is currently at war. Under these circumstances, the demons might well become his allies. And if he manages to quietly free one of the prisoners, that's the perfect chance to establish connections and sell himself for a profit. The young man threw his arms up and announced at the top of his lungs that a glimmer of hope had finally appeared and he was beginning to prepare for immigration. Since they won't let him make a living in the kingdom of humans, he'll make his money in the land of demons. The city of Burson, the northern border of the kingdom of Ruhumanier. A black car pulled up in front of a massive gray building devoid of any unnecessary ornamentation. Two guards, Lieutenant Colonel Yakov, and the protagonist stepped out. Araya froze in place and silently surveyed his surroundings for a few seconds. Long, solid walls, narrow barred windows, and guards with weapons at the ready at the entrance. One of the soldiers shoved him in the back with the barrel of his gun and curtly ordered him to follow. There was a few minutes of silence as they all moved through the corridors together. The group stopped in front of one of the doors. Schwiesen knocked, and it swung open almost immediately. Junior Lieutenant Gorgon Svitracha stepped forward, a portly, balding middle-aged man. He raised his hand to his head in a salute and cheerfully exclaimed that Lieutenant Colonel Schwiesen had finally arrived. The journey from the capital must have been long, and they were surely tired. Yakov didn't respond to the greetings and got straight to the point, asking how the interrogation was going. Had the prisoners spilled anything yet? Araya stayed a step behind and listened intently to the conversation. Svitracha walked up to the door of one of the cells and muttered that the torture seemed to have been too gentle. And in the next second, the door swung open. Standing before them was a large demon. Several bony protrusions on his head, a powerful, muscular body. His hands and feet were shackled, and around his neck was a collar attached to chains secured to the wall. He sat unconscious on a stone chair, and there was hardly a spot on him not covered in scars or dry blood. Next to him stood a table with instruments laid out on it. Schwiesen looked at the prisoner and muttered that he understood everything. It meant they had tried everything. The lieutenant replied that this demonic officer possessed monstrous willpower. At this rate, he would die before he spoke. Yakov sighed, then abruptly grabbed the dark healer by the scruff of his neck and shoved him forward so that he fell right to his knees next to the prisoner. Svitracha immediately jumped up to the lieutenant colonel and, wringing his hands in delight, began to praise him, saying that Schwiesen, as always, was on top of his game, and he couldn't believe he'd found such a specialist. Paying no attention to this, Yakov continued. This Kiwi Araya's dark healing is extremely effective, so he shouldn't be allowed to come into contact with the prisoners for more than a minute. Although the shackles are enchanted with the holy magic of the high clergy, if the demon fully regains his strength, he won't vouch for their safety. Then the lieutenant colonel turned to the second lieutenant and ordered him to increase security around the prisoners and keep a close eye on the dark healer. Svitracha nodded vigorously and was already ready to run off to carry out the orders. But Yakov held out his hand toward Araya. He leaned toward him and said quietly, almost without inflection, "If he lets the demon die, he'll kill him. If he tries to escape, he'll kill him." And he asked if he understood everything. The protagonist clenched his teeth and nodded. In his mind, he had already begun to formulate a plan. Free the demon before he kicked the bucket, avoid arousing suspicion among these fools, and make a run for it with the captive. All in all, everything was clear. Next, the junior lieutenant spoke up, saluted, and declared with undisguised smugness that as long as he was there, this prisoner wouldn't be going anywhere. The lieutenant colonel left the room, and, as he was walking out, with his hands clasped behind his back, he nodded and tossed over his shoulder that he was counting on the guy. Svitracha quietly clicked his tongue in response. As soon as they were alone, the guard pulled out a pistol and pressed it against Araya's head, ordering him to quickly heal the prisoner's right hand. And only the right hand, no tricks. The guy gave him a grim look, but muttered that he understood. And he walked over to the prisoner. He examined it carefully. He touched his right hand, and in the next second, barely audibly, almost silently, the demon asked to be killed. Araya raised his eyebrows in surprise, but didn't let it show. The voice was quiet, but there was a strength in it that refused to submit. The protagonist lowered his gaze and replied, just as quietly, that he would not kill him, for he was a dark healer. His specialty was healing. The very next second, a gun was pressed against the back of Araya's head again, and the guard ordered him to be silent. A few minutes later, the man walked over to the tool bench and muttered that the healer had dragged it out until the last second, and that was enough for today. A room had been prepared for the protagonist. He was allowed to leave only for work. Spatracha picked up a pair of pliers, clicked them menacingly, and added, addressing Araya, that otherwise he would be listed as a fugitive, and then the guy would have only himself to blame. A short while later, Araya found himself in the room assigned to him. Putting his hands in his pockets, he glanced around and muttered to himself that it was cramped, dusty, a typical punishment cell, and snorted, noting that it was simply a disgusting place. Then he mentally added that a solitary confinement cell was, at least, comfortable. During the encounter, he'd managed to study the demonic officer's anatomy and scanned every cell. That's why he dragged it out until the very last second, conducting a full diagnostic. All of this for one thing, the perfect escape. He muttered quietly, almost inaudibly, that he apologized, but all the other prisoners would have to be patient a little longer. Then he waved his hand. Dark magic immediately began to spark across his palm. Araya muttered that it was time to begin developing a special dark spell that would turn this game on its head. The second night, Araya returned to his cell and managed to eat. He moved with difficulty, barely able to bend, and at some point, he couldn't hold back a groan, muttering that his whole body ached. Then he sank onto the bed, rolled his shoulders and neck, closed his eyes against the pain, and muttered that they'd been running him ragged from morning till night. But at least now he'd be able to send a message. The guy ran his fingers over his arm, and letters appeared on his skin. They said that if the recipient read the message, they should bend their index finger 3 times. As soon as he removed his fingers, the words vanished with a small burst of flame, and Araya muttered to himself that this was the perfect disguise. He recalled everything he'd been led through these past few days and mentally replayed every detail. There were a total of 3 demons in this location, 1 officer in the East Wing and 2 privates in the West. The garrison numbered between 30 and 50 soldiers. There was only 1 entrance, but each wing had a single back door. All of this was a military secret, impossible to record on paper, so he had to go over it again and again, committing it to memory. One thing he understood perfectly well over these days: the demonic officer with bony horn-like growths, the first one he'd worked with, will be capable of capturing this entire facility single-handedly at full strength, which meant he had to free that one first. With his powerful wings, he'd be able to grab Araya and fly off to the land of demons without drawing unnecessary attention. The first condition for their escape was to create that very special dark healing spell. The second, and perhaps most important, step was to convey the entire plan to the demonic officer. Araya rubbed his hand and stared at the blank wall with a slight smirk, muttering that their modest, so-called correspondence would begin tomorrow. The third day arrived. Araya was sent to a cell with the officer he needed. Standing over him was Second Lieutenant Gorgon, holding a whip in his hands and looking extremely grim, constantly urging him to hurry up with the treatment and remarking that the protagonist seemed completely useless. The dark healer exhaled mentally and thought that a submissive demeanor was also an important step toward escape. He knelt down next to the demon and touched the demon's right hand. Act cautiously, don't arouse suspicion. That's what matters most right now. Almost halfway through the spell, Gorgon snapped his whip, Audea Fidinchit, and barely turned his head. The lieutenant slumped in his chair, yawning, and wondered if this healer couldn't work a little faster. After all, if he didn't hurry up, the time would be deducted from Gorgon's own break. Araya let out a barely perceptible sigh, turned to the guard, and told himself that the most important thing was not to give himself away. Then, with a completely unruffled expression, he began to explain. Of course he could hear the guard, but it was impossible to speed up the dark healing process. Noticing the confusion on the soldier's face, the protagonist shrugged and began to patiently explain that with such injuries, before closing the wound, it was necessary to stimulate self-regeneration and sterilize the area. It depended on the patient's body, but the time could not be shortened because if this step was skipped, the risk of sepsis increases, and in the worst case, serious dysfunction of internal organs cannot be ruled out. Gorgon didn't let him finish. He shouted that he understood everything and asked the protagonist to be quiet. Then he urged him to finish quickly. Araya turned back to the patient and frowned, noting to himself that he was very lucky to have such a dim-witted guard. The question was whether the officer would notice the message hidden on his arm from prying eyes. Day 4. The guy found himself back in the demonic officer's torture chamber. He rubbed his hands, stepped closer, and asked aloud, as if talking to himself, how the patient was feeling. And in that very second, his eyes widened. He saw a barely perceptible twitch of the index finger. 3 bends, exactly as the message had said. Araya's face lit up, and he thought it was brilliant. The demonic officer had noticed it on the very first day. The young man knelt down again and, as he began treating the hand, sent a new message. He would work to free all the captive demons, including the officer himself. If the officer agreed, he should give the same sign as before. If not, he should bend his thumb 5 times. The next day, The reply came again with 3 bends of the index finger. The exchange of messages continued every day. Short, one-sided signals through which it was impossible to convey all the details of the plan without misunderstanding. But Araya's priority now wasn't to make friends, but to show that he was someone worth using. A week had passed since he began assisting with interrogations. This time, the guy was present in the cell not with the demonic officer, but with the harpy girl. She was kneeling, her arms stretched above her head and chained, her eyes covered by a blindfold. The same sound rang out again and again, the sharp crack of a whip against skin. The second lieutenant laughed, sighed heavily, and muttered that she was silent again. Whether one demon or another, it was just a mockery. The girl didn't react at all, so he continued, saying that a filthy spawn should know its place. Although, he had to admit, she certainly had patience to spare. Covering one eye with his hand, looking like a man who was thoroughly fed up with all this, Gorgon added that if the harpy gave a name, so be it. Tomorrow, this one would be gone. But let her keep in mind, first come, first served, and if other demons speak up first, it would be a shame to be left with nothing. In response, there was a barely audible mumble. The lieutenant put his hand to his ear with feigned interest and asked her to repeat herself. The harpy raised her head, slowly, with an effort that was clearly not easy, and very quietly, but with complete seriousness, wished him to die. No sooner had he heard the harpy's reply than Gorgon swung his fist and struck her across the cheek. She, lurching heavily to the side, dropped her head, and fell silent. Then he pulled a pistol from its holster and shouted furiously that she'd gotten on his nerves. He pressed the barrel against the girl's head, and he kept yelling that the demons thought they wouldn't kill these ones. Of course, he tried not to let it come to that, but keeping them alive 3 times a day was hellish work. So it's no big deal to let one of them go. The harpy didn't react. She had lost consciousness. Araya stepped forward, placing himself directly between her and the gun, and pushed the barrel aside, asking him to wait. Gorgon frowned furiously and asked what the hell gave him the right to stop him. The guy frantically ran through his true motives in his head and realized it wouldn't work. He'd promised the demonic officer that they'd escape together with all the prisoners, and if there was one less here, their already fragile cooperation would simply collapse. Out loud, however, he gave the official line. Killing on one's own initiative wasn't the best idea, and asked if the subject wasn't under Lieutenant Colonel Shui's jurisdiction. Gorgon thoughtfully rubbed his chin and muttered that it was true. A lowly soldier like him wasn't supposed to decide the fate of prisoners. Araya exhaled mentally, thinking that even he was powerless to resurrect a demon that was truly dead. And it seemed that right now, while he was painstakingly preparing a dark healing spell for their escape, this harpy had come dangerously close to becoming a loose end in someone else's plan. He certainly didn't want everything to fall apart at the last minute. For a second, he closed his eyes, already picturing in his mind how things would turn out in the future. And the next second, the butt of the pistol slammed into his head. Gorgon nearly went mad with rage, waved his arm, and yelled that this moron had fallen for it, then asked if he really thought he'd just agree to it so easily. Gorgon once again pressed the barrel against the harpy's head. By this time, she had regained consciousness and had been watching the altercation in surprise for a while. Gorgon explained that the torture of this subject was entirely entrusted to him, which meant that if he went a little overboard and finished off the demon, there would be no problem. Araya's eyes widened, and he frantically began to think of something to say that might turn the situation around. He spread his arms and muttered, "What a shame to destroy his chance for a promotion with his own hands." Gorgon turned sharply toward him, stumbling slightly, and asked in surprise. Araya stretched slowly, loosening his muscles, and smiled. And he thought to himself that he'd just spouted complete nonsense, and it had worked. This vile man was already well past his prime, stuck in the position of executioner. What kind of promotion could there possibly be? Gorgon, without waiting for an answer, widened his eyes, and with feigned astonishment, he began to mutter. Could it be that Lieutenant Colonel Shuizen, through the role of executioner, was giving him experience in gathering intelligence, so that in the future he could be transferred to the intelligence department, where the army's elite gathered? Carefully ignoring the blood trickling down his forehead from the blow with the butt of the rifle, the protagonist snapped his fingers and said that was exactly the case. And then he added to himself that it was an excellent idea and he would definitely take advantage of it. Aloud, he continued, "They say a new special unit is being formed in the intelligence department, a so-called interrogation squad that extracts information by keeping demons on the brink of life and death. And the lieutenant colonel wants to appoint Gorgon, who has gained experience here, as the mentor for this squad." Listening to all this, Gorgon lowered his hand holding the pistol and asked in surprise, "How did the dark healer know this?" Araya shrugged slightly and explained that on the train ride here, he'd overheard Shuizen talking with other senior officers about how Second Lieutenant Gorgon showed great promise, and the lieutenant colonel had high hopes for him. Gorgon asked again, almost bewildered, Had they really said that? The guy threw up his hands and continued. Gorgon is currently on probation, and that's the whole point. Shuizen specifically assigned a dark healer to him to keep the demons alive as long as possible. If Gorgon fails the torture or kills the subject right here, what will the lieutenant colonel think? The overseer became increasingly convinced that this was true and muttered aloud that it would be a failure. Shuizen would be disappointed, and he could forget about the instructor position. Then, in a louder voice, he ordered Araya to heal the demon as quickly as possible. Araya nodded, and he approached the harpy, mentally noting how fortunate it was that this dim-witted officer had swallowed a whole bunch of lies. However, the next second, a hand landed on his shoulder. Gorgon muttered that it seemed he had underestimated him, and with a gleam in his eyes, he explained that the dark healer had saved him from a serious mistake at the very last moment, and for that he was sincerely grateful. Araya shook his head and said he had merely done his duty. Gorgon didn't let go of his hand and muttered that he wanted to introduce himself properly once more, Gorgon Svitracha, and that he decided to consider the dark healer a trustworthy partner. Then he apologized for beating and kicking him all this time. Araya thought absently that this guy had taken a liking to him a little too quickly, though it didn't really matter. Their acquaintance wouldn't last long. Because if everything went according to plan, Gorgon would be dead by tomorrow. The train station in the capital of the kingdom of Rue Humanier. Shuizen stepped off the train, holding a small briefcase in his hands. He walked through the station, thinking that it wasn't that he liked the noise, but right now it sounded almost like the fanfare of a triumphant return. All that was left was to submit his report to the intelligence agency, and the case would be closed. For the first time in a week, he would finally be going home. And at that thought, the lieutenant colonel blushed slightly and caught himself dreaming that Ellie was waiting for him with dinner. Although he really hoped she hadn't made red wine stew with sausages, because the stinking, bloodied entrails of demonic scum, severed fingers, and the like would immediately come to mind, and he wouldn't make it to the table. After passing through the final security checkpoint, he stepped out of the station, building onto the street. A car pulled up in front of him, and a woman's voice called out his rank. Shuizen spun around abruptly and exclaimed in surprise, "What is Lady Artemis doing here?" It was Artemis Eretissa, fourth in the hierarchy of the royal church, holder of the title of saint. The young woman peered out the window, blinked with a completely serene expression, and said in a gentle voice that they hadn't seen each other in a long time, and then asked if he'd like to go for a ride. She'd give him a lift home. The car door swung open immediately, leaving him little choice, and the lieutenant colonel, slightly embarrassed, muttered that in that case they should do just that. A short while later, they were already driving down the road. A tense silence reigned for a few minutes. Shuizen glanced at his companion out of the corner of his eye. Artemis, adjusting her cloak slightly on her shoulders, bowed her head and thanked the lieutenant colonel with a smile for his hard work on the mission. He immediately began to protest and thanked her for her concern, but couldn't resist asking how she had managed to find him in such a crowd. The girl chuckled softly and said she had been waiting specifically for him. And then, without any transition, she asked how Kiwi Araya, whom he had taken away, was doing. The lieutenant colonel raised his eyebrows, and he noted to himself that it was Saint Artemis who had told him about the dark healer back when intelligence needed a specialist. Usually this is a military secret, but there is an unspoken rule. The royal army and the church get along well. Coming to his senses, he explained that the healer had seemed lost in thought the entire way. He looked rather depressed. Artemis waved her hand and clarified. Wasn't he, as far as she knew, tasked with the torture? Shuizen nodded and corrected her. Strictly speaking, assisting with the torture. The interrogations themselves are conducted by a local officer, a man without any particular talents, but with extremely low morals, a propensity for violence, and high patriotism. The ideal candidate. As for the healer himself, they're using him to the fullest right now. He's surely on the verge of physical and mental exhaustion. Serves him right, Shuizen added. With a slight surge of enthusiasm, he explained that the protagonist had turned the clinic from monsters into a business, which contradicts divine teachings, and so divine retribution has caught up with him. He got a little carried away, but suddenly caught himself and realized who he was talking to and what he was saying, and cut himself off mid-sentence, apologizing. To speak of divine retribution in front of a saint was, perhaps, a bit presumptuous. Artemis shrugged, pressed her hand to her chest, and murmured barely audibly that yes, that was exactly how it was. And the lieutenant colonel was absolutely right. At these words, her face darkened slightly, and she turned away toward the window, and she continued speaking, almost quoting, that blessing is for the sacred, destruction for the demonic. That is precisely what is written in the sacred scriptures. Absolute truth. That is exactly why a profession as slippery as that of a dark healer cannot be left unchecked. Shuizen paled slightly and nodded silently. Silence hung in the car for a couple of seconds. Then Artemis laughed again, and clenching her fists tightly, she said that among the gifted dark healers who heal those who harm the holy people, there is no one more dangerous than traitors, and under no circumstances should they be left at large. And this applies to Kiwi Araya, in particular, without a doubt. The lieutenant colonel paled even more, beads of sweat forming on his forehead, but he nodded fiercely, while mentally asking himself, why is the saint so obsessed with this particular dark healer? Artemis covered her mouth with her hand, oblivious to her companion's expression, and continued with a laugh, saying how wonderful it was that this guy would never see the light of day again. Like a captive demon, he would spend the rest of his days in a dungeon. Shuizhen didn't react out loud and thought it best not to ask any unnecessary questions, and he wanted to get home as soon as possible, where his beloved was waiting. Meanwhile, in the distant city of Burson, Araya lay on the bed, having taken off his shoes, his hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling. And he thought about what the harpy looked like. As soon as he reached out his hand, she immediately tried to pull away. A perfectly natural reaction. To her, he was still one of her tormentors. At least until today, anyway. In his memories, he would kneel on one knee, keeping a short distance between them, and speak so softly, just loud enough for her to hear but not the Gorgon, that she shouldn't worry, that soon she would be flying freely again. The harpy lowered her eyes, not believing a single word. Araya watched her and thought that these were not words of comfort for her, but words to strengthen his own resolve. You can't put off the inevitable forever. The captive demons are suffering, and his task as a dark healer is to save these patients as soon as possible. Now everything is ready for the escape. The die is cast. Meanwhile, in another part of the prison, a captive demonic officer barely moved his fingers, and a message appeared on his hand. The plan will be carried out tomorrow, during the dark healing session after the torture. If he is ready, 3 bends of the index finger. All that remained for Araya was to gather her will into a fist and act. Tomorrow they would put an end to all of this. The next morning, the day to carry out the plan had finally arrived. Araya met Gorgon in the hallway, and the man was literally beaming. He put his arm around the dark healer's shoulders and cheerfully announced that today seemed to be a pretty uneventful day for his partner. Araya looked around. Bloodstained saws hung on the wall in front of him, neatly arranged in a row, frowned slightly, and muttered that yes, he didn't think there would be any problems. Gorgon was still smiling and muttered that was great. Today they'd be working with a spark too. Humming something under his breath, he walked past the 2 guards at the door and said aloud with a smile, looking forward to it. Today the demonic officer would finally spill all the information. Araya gritted his teeth and turned away, so no one would notice the look on his face. Gorgon settled into a chair off to the side and waved his hand. The rest was up to the healer. The officer needed to be treated properly, but not to the point of full recovery. Having said that, he chuckled softly. Araya took a few steps forward and stopped near the chair where the demonic officer was chained. He folded his hands in front of him, bowed his head slightly, and asked how his patient was feeling. The demon, covered in scars, twitched his index finger 3 times, barely noticeably. Noticing this, Araya smiled faintly and thought that the prisoners seemed to have been ready for a long time. But aloud he said that they should begin then. Expecting no trickery, Gorgon slumped back in his chair, threw his arm behind his head, and shouted that the dark healer should show what the kingdom's finest specialist was capable of. Araya paid no attention to this. He placed his palm against the demonic officer's arm and quietly said that he apologized for making him wait so long for this day. Then a white flame spread along the arm, and in the next second, it began to spread rapidly throughout the demon's body, healing scars, closing wounds, and restoring what had been destroyed over weeks. Speaking louder now, Araya added that the demon could now run wild to his heart's content. The captive felt a surge of strength and opened his eyes wide, and with a single clench of his fist, he shattered the shackles. The demon rose to his feet, his black eyes flashing, and exhaled heavily. And in the next second, he swung his right arm. 2 guards flew off to the sides like rag dolls, slammed into the wall, and collapsed to the floor. Splatters of blood remained on the stone. Gorgon leapt to his feet, but he didn't have time to do anything. The demon had already reached out to him and lifted him up, grabbing him by the collar. He only managed to groan something, clinging to the grip. The demon bared his teeth and asked his executioner, what was his name? Though come to think of it, it didn't matter anymore. A long life lay behind him, but he had never experienced such warm hospitality before. Gorgon, too stunned to think straight, stammered, what the hell is going on? And called out to Araya, his partner, or so he thought. Then, almost screaming, he wailed, why is the demon completely healed? Is this another test from Lieutenant Colonel Shuizhen? Araya shook his head and, completely calmly, without the slightest expression on his face, asked Gorgon for forgiveness, because everything he had spouted yesterday was utter nonsense. Gorgon jumped up and, in shock, asked what on earth he was talking about. The next second, the demon tightened his grip and slashed his face with his claws. Blood trickled down his cheek, dripping onto the floor, and Gorgon groaned barely audibly, pausing after every word, asking his former partner to heal him. Araya folded his arms across his chest, turned away, and, closing his eyes, said completely impassively that he had to apologize, but he didn't heal humans. He was, after all, a dark healer. Hearing this, the demon laughed, then fell silent, calmed down, and said thoughtfully that the executioner's name seemed to be Second Lieutenant Gorgon. Silence reigned for a second, and Gorgon, barely breathing, asked, "Why such cruelty? Where did all this come from?" The demon curled his upper lip, baring his teeth, raised his eyebrows, and asked, "Is the man serious? He is truly hopeless." Then he addressed him almost gently, calling him Captain, and ordered him to accept his fate humbly. In the next second, with a barely perceptible movement, the demon severed his head from his body and flung it aside. Araya rested his hand on his chin and asked, "Why, Captain?" The demon chuckled softly. He turned to him and then asked, "In the kingdom of men, aren't those who die in the line of duty promoted 2 ranks at once?" Then he stepped closer to the dark healer and bowed his head slightly, not mockingly, but with sincere gratitude. And he asked, "The dark healer's name is Araya, if I understood correctly?" Araya nodded, then spread his hands and asked, "How then should he address him?" The demon frowned and introduced himself as Agito. Lord Agito, although his savior didn't have to be so polite. In the next instant, Agito made a barely perceptible movement and found himself behind Araya, his hand resting on the man's neck, ready to strike. He quietly added that, however, just because the protagonist had saved him didn't mean they were allies. Then he leaned close to his ear and whispered, asking what he was after. That was precisely what he hadn't been able to figure out from the brief signals. What did the dark healer intend to do once he freed all the demons? Araya narrowed his eyes, trying to make out the figure behind him, and muttered that it was impossible to convey his true intentions through signals, which was why he had remained silent until today. Agito snorted and ordered him to speak. The young man paled slightly, but said in a steady voice that he wanted to move to the demon realm. Agito snorted again and suggested that there was no place for a dark healer in the human kingdom, so he wanted to emigrate and make a living there. That actually made sense. He would believe his words and actions for now. Araya nodded and thanked Lord Agito, thinking to himself that the groundwork had been laid. The demon shrugged slightly and headed for the exit of the cell, tossing out as he went that he could be relied upon. If he and his brothers managed to escape this place, he would take the dark healer to the land of demons. Araya closed his eyes for a second. Fortunately, Agito had remained calm. In the worst-case scenario, he could have been killed right there on the spot. The freed demon could have torn his head off for participating in the torture instead of helping him sooner. But even fully healed, even free, Agito surely harbored a deep-seated hatred toward him, a human. The phrase, "I'll believe you for now," spoke both of his high self-control and of the fact that his trust and doubt in this matter were currently about 50-50. That was enough for now. Araya stepped out of the cell and muttered that they wouldn't waste a second and that the first thing they needed to do was free the other 2 demons. He added silently that his goal right now wasn't sincere trust. As long as he's useful to Agito, his life is safe, which means he needs to advertise his usefulness in such a way so that this one couldn't refuse. Upon reaching the West Wing, they first freed Forte, the bipedal avian demon. Next, they headed to another cell. Hearing a noise in the corridor, a harpy named her and jerked upright and stared at the newcomers. Then her face lit up. She smiled and, stumbling over her words with excitement, asked, "Is that really Lord Agito?" The Lord called her by name, then, frowning, began to examine her injuries. Agito paused, then added quietly, but with a palpable weight in his voice, that he was very glad she had lived to see this moment. The protagonist quietly shushed him and asked him to speak more quietly, since the patrol might hear. Agito closed his eyes, grunted, and said that was true. Then he turned to Forte and asked if he would cover the entrance. The demon clicked his beak and nodded. Agito turned to Araya and asked him to heal the harpy's wounds. Araya nodded and said everything was ready. The next second, a soft white glow enveloped the girl. When it faded, not a single wound remained on the harpy's body. Hearn looked at her body in confusion, raised her hands to her face, blushed slightly, and then asked in a barely audible voice, "Is this a dream?" Agito walked over to her, placed a hand on her shoulder, and with his other hand gave her a light tap on the head, saying, "No, this is reality." He chuckled, then turned to the protagonist and remarked that no matter how much he'd observed his dark healing, it was flawless. Araya smiled broadly, and said that it was his own unique art. Agito frowned slightly, rested his hand on his chin, and muttered that no matter how many times he saw it, he still couldn't believe his eyes. Even the best healers in the demonic realm aren't capable of healing at such a speed. Araya thought to himself that there was a secret behind such speed. But aloud, he explained that the healing he had just used was actually completely useless to anyone other than these three. Seeing the demon in front of him frown, the protagonist added that he had spent several days constructing spells tailored specifically to the anatomy and to each of these individuals. Ironically, this had only been possible thanks to his own work as the executioner's assistant. Agito looked at him and muttered quietly, "So that's how it is." The next second, Araya dropped abruptly to his knees and pressed his forehead against the floor, asking to be allowed to apologize once more to all three of them. Agito exclaimed furiously, stumbling over his words and asking what on earth the Dark Healer was talking about. The young man didn't lift his head, conveying the full depth of his remorse, and said that he had silently watched as these people maimed the demons, and for a whole week had essentially allowed them to die. Agito bared his teeth slightly and said that they didn't feel abandoned. Araya continued. He had seen their suffering with his own eyes and coldly looked away. Agito asked why he was now putting his sins on display. Araya explained that this was his duty as the guilty party. At the same time, he was thinking that it was impossible to completely erase their hatred for humans, and it was unknown when that hatred would explode and turn against him. That meant he needed to create a situation where they simply couldn't refuse. That is precisely what would increase his chances of escape. Aloud, raising his voice, the Dark Healer continued, saying that if these demons were capable of accepting someone like him, then he swore to devote all his strength and knowledge to bringing them home to the land of demons. He smiled broadly to himself, because they still needed him, so Agito would most likely say, "You are forgiven," and if the boss forgives him, his subordinates will have no choice but to agree. The trap will snap shut. All that remained was to wait for the forgiveness to be spoken aloud. Just then, Hearn spoke up, leaning forward slightly, and asked to be allowed to speak. Agito looked at her and nodded. She explained that Araya was saying he had abandoned them, but that wasn't true. Yesterday, he had shielded her from a bullet with his own body. Agito's eyes widened as he looked at his subordinate. Araya flinched inwardly without looking up and thought that it seemed things hadn't gone quite according to plan. Hearn continued. Yesterday, she had gone up against that executioner, ready to die. But Araya shielded her with his own body, and even under the blows of the pistol's grip, he didn't back down a single step. To be honest, at that moment Hearn was even cursing him, since she wished she were dead, but he knew this day would come. Araya raised his head and looked at the harpy in front of him in confusion. Agito said that everything was correct. Thanks to the secret plan, everything had gone exactly as intended. Hearn placed her hand on her chest, bowed her head, and said she was immensely grateful, for thanks to the Dark Healer, she hadn't perished and was still alive today. Araya frowned and muttered that he hadn't done anything special. Hearn instantly sprang to her feet, thrust her claws forward, and shouted furiously, "What are you saying?" And then she asked him not to misunderstand her. And she asked, did he really think her gratitude was just empty formality? No, such gratitude must be accepted with dignity. And so, no matter how much he berated himself, she asked Agito not to blame him. Agito closed his eyes, folded his arms across his chest, and said that it was truly incredible. This man had been saving his subordinates behind his back. All he needed to do was thank him. What fault was there? But as he spoke these words, barely visible tears welled up in his eyes. Araya sat on the floor, bewildered, not understanding how things had come to this. To be honest, he had expected the harpy to curse him as an accomplice to the executioners. The girl approached him, held out her hand, and said that from now on they were equal comrades, which meant they needed to escape from here together. Araya gratefully took her hand and said that she was a good person. At that, the harpy turned away, embarrassed, and muttered that the only good person here was the Dark Healer. Suddenly, a piercing siren wailed throughout the building. Araya jumped and muttered that they'd been exposed sooner than he'd thought. The patrol had apparently noticed something was amiss, and they needed to get out of there immediately. Agito nodded in agreement and said that there was only one question left. How would they break through into the land of demons? Araya looked at him and asked what he was thinking about. Agito turned to the guy and said he wanted to hear his opinion and that he currently had two options. The protagonist immediately interrupted and said he knew what the best option for the demons was, to kill every single soldier. Agito nodded and added that they were, after all, his fellow citizens. Araya shrugged and smirked, for this was an inevitable sacrifice for a safe escape. He, too, had been calculating their escape routes. Two main scenarios. The first, betting on speed, they break through to the border, ignoring the pursuit. The second, Betting on power, they overwhelm the garrison and secure a safe retreat. Agito rubbed his chin thoughtfully and said they were thinking exactly the same way. Araya continued, saying that the second option seemed to him the only reliable one. The border town of Eldon is occupied by humans, so the first plan is suicide. The logic is simple. The human army awaits ahead, and the pursuers will strike from behind. They'll simply be caught in a pincer movement. The threat from the rear must be eliminated right now. But there is a way to guarantee success almost certainly. Araya said he had a proposal. Some of the defeated soldiers must be deliberately left alive, because the army will have to rescue its own seriously wounded instead of chasing after them, and this minimizes the risk of pursuit. Mentally, he was somewhat shocked by his own thoughts. But Agito would do the bulk of the dirty work. And over the past week of torture, he'd gotten to know this demon well enough to understand one thing. The power slumbering within it was monstrous. If Agito really let loose, the remaining soldiers would beg for death, and yet they would be deliberately left to suffer. Let them call him the devil himself, he didn't care. He had no sympathy left for those who had trampled on his rights and taken away the clinic to which he had devoted 10 years of his life. He would stop at nothing to build a new life. Agito closed his eyes, chuckled, and said that, in spirit, the protagonist was a true dark healer. Araya looked at him and said that his heart belonged entirely to the darkness, for he was well aware of the value of life, both human and demonic. Agito nodded, and he said that sparing the soldiers' lives could be considered a reward for Araya's efforts, and that he would do his best to make it happen. The protagonist bowed and thanked them for taking his humble idea seriously. Agito turned and said quietly that respect for life and the kindness that prevents him from becoming a monster to the very end make him a truly great dark healer. Araya smiled and thought to himself, was it his imagination, or had the demon really said something about a kind heart? It seemed he had been slightly overestimated, and in completely the wrong way. Not noticing the hesitation, Agito asked him to tell him everything he knew about the target. After listening, Agito waved his hand and grunted. So, about 100 ordinary soldiers and not a single member of the hero's squad. The capture would be easy. Then he asked where they would meet. Araya replied that the back entrance of the West Wing was the most secluded spot. Agito nodded, ducked as he left the room, and called out as he went that he understood everything. He'd caused quite a commotion there in the meantime, and they could move out. Araya thought to himself, poor royal soldiers. If they want to blame someone, let them blame the late Shuizhen from intelligence. If he hadn't dragged him here, nothing would have happened. Though it was too late now. A few seconds later, the protagonist nodded to the two demons and told them they were leaving too. He walked over to the door and urged them to move quickly. They moved slowly and quietly down the corridor. Araya walked ahead, thinking about how Agito, their main defense, had gone off on his own, leaving them unarmed, and how he himself was a dead weight hanging around their necks. They had to avoid any confrontations at all costs. Forte clicked his beak and said they mustn't become a burden to Master Agito. The harpy nodded in agreement, throwing her arms behind her head, and in the next second, she flapped her wings. She grabbed Araya by the arm so that he was simply hanging there, and they dashed forward down the corridor. One of the soldiers spotted them and opened fire. But Forte didn't lose his cool. He flapped his wing, and his flight feathers, as hard as blades, pierced several officers right through. Araya froze in shock and stared at the demons in amazement. Forte clicked his beak and explained that they were, after all, Lord Agito's personal air squadron. Shots rang out again, and Forte took cover behind his wings. Forte added that he didn't mean to brag, but they were the true elite. Then Hearn burst forward. She tossed Araya into the air so that Forte could intercept him. And in a split second, making several sharp turns, she sliced through the remaining soldiers with her wings. Then she immediately appeared right beside him and said that they wouldn't let a single hair fall from the Dark Healer's head. Then they flew down the corridors again. Araya thought to himself that the demons were incredibly strong, a welcome change to his plans. But aloud, he asked about what was really troubling him. How had fighters like these ended up in captivity in the first place? He knew from the newspapers that the human army had won the battle for Eldon, but he still couldn't believe that he and Agito had simply allowed themselves to be captured. Hearn sighed heavily and remained silent, staring straight ahead. Then Forte spoke up and said that they had been attacked without a declaration of war. The border wall collapsed instantly, swept away by some unknown destructive weapon, and the priests, taking advantage of the chaos, poured in after it and opened up a vast holy zone. Araya nodded and repeated. They say the holy zone suppresses dark creatures. Forte confirmed. Fighting inside the barrier was pure suicide, but someone had to put themselves in the line of fire so the people of Eldon could escape. Araya looked up and asked again, was that really why Lord Agito and they had stayed behind? Forte shook his head. It wasn't just them. Many of their comrades had stayed to fight, but in their current state, the hero's squad was too much for them to handle. Araya thought about how the hero was the mightiest swordsman, chosen by sacred powers, the bearer of the ancient relic of the human kingdom. No matter how widespread firearms became, the power of the sacred sword remained absolute. Hearn sighed heavily as she listened to all this, frowned, and then said that if only they had managed to hold the Elden Wall back then. Araya sighed, looked at her, but said nothing. Suddenly, an elderly voice rang out from somewhere, chanting the spell of the holy zone. The demons instantly collapsed to the ground. They were breathing heavily, barely moving, and moaning in pain. Araya darted between them, trying to figure out what was happening. Standing before them was an old man in a robe, holding a book in his hands. He raised his eyebrows and said, without the slightest trace of concern in his voice, "Only 3? For such a trifle, I alone am more than enough." Araya heard these words, stepped forward, and stood in front of the demons, shielding them with his own body. Araya frowned and asked, looking at the old man in front of him, "Are you a high-ranking priest?" It was Lucius Satania, who held the 12th rank in the hierarchy of the royal church. The old man raised his eyebrows in surprise, and he clutched the book tighter in his hands, noticing that one of them was still moving. He had come to renew the holy magic, yet the sinners only multiplied their sins. But he would not allow them to run wild here any longer. The time had come to bring God's punishment down upon them. Araya glanced at the clergyman and muttered that now he understood. It was he who had cast the spell on the shackles. And of all days, he had to show up on the very day of the escape. What bad luck! The priest raised the scripture and asked again, "Bad luck? No, this is no accident. It is God's will. A sinner must state his name before God, and after death, this will count as yet another virtue." The protagonist sighed, and he muttered that there had been a bit of a misunderstanding between them, and, noticing the confusion on the old man's face, explained that Lucius's words were slightly, no, completely, misdirected. The old man shouted that he wouldn't allow it, for the lad was clearly planning to strike from behind while he was talking his ear off. These were the typical underhanded methods of the Spawn of Darkness. The influence of the Holy Zone is weak because Araya's phase of darkness is too insignificant. However, the word of his God is the highest holy magic, which will condemn and dispel even the slightest evil. The protagonist nearly beamed at these words, raised his hands, and calmly waited to see what would happen next. The next second, the priest raised the book, recited the incantation, and a glowing orb appeared in his palm. And he hurled it at Araya, ordering him not to even think that the work of darkness could defeat a pious saint. For a brief moment, everything was flooded with bright white light. And then the orb simply struck Araya and faded away, causing not the slightest harm. The priest froze, not understanding what was happening. The protagonist explained that Lord Lucius seemed to be mistaken. He was not a demon, but an ordinary human. Holy magic only works on demons and evil spirits born of darkness. But on him, born human, it has no effect whatsoever. And since the topic had come up, Araya added, a priest of that age was hardly that strong in hand-to-hand combat. And in terms of physical attributes, the advantage clearly lay with the guy who wasn't even 30. Then he frowned, smirked, and muttered that he'd drawn an unlucky opponent. The priest frowned, stumbled, and shouted, "How can he not be a demon?" After all, with that devilish smirk on his face, pale as a ghost, with dark circles under his eyes. The protagonist frowned indignantly at this description and said that his pallor was natural, and the circles under his eyes were simply from lack of sleep. The work of a dark healer was quite demanding. Silence reigned for a couple of seconds. Then Araya took a few steps forward and, in one swift motion, snatched the book from the priest's hands, holding it high, and apologized, but said he couldn't let the old man go. He would take the book for himself for now. The priest immediately began jumping around him, reaching out and demanding it back, calling him a heretic. Araya calmly continued. Even he, a man far removed from the church, having lived in this kingdom for more than 25 years, knew perfectly well that holy magic was infused precisely into the sacred scriptures. The old man reached for the book again and stammered, asking if the young man wasn't ashamed to help barbaric, malicious demons. Araya shrugged with a smirk and said that they seemed, by all accounts, rational and kind. Look how they'd immediately taken an interest in him. The priest shouted that they were enemies of humanity. Araya immediately objected. Didn't the scriptures say to love your enemy? The old man finally lost his temper and shouted that he was dealing with a brat. And he lunged at the boy, demanding he stop spouting nonsense. He knocked him to the ground and reached for the book with both hands. The next second, there were 3 pins in his head. The priest froze and didn't move anymore. Araya turned slightly and thanked the demons. Forte nodded and said the thanks were due to him. It was Araya who had taken the scripture, and now they could move again. Araya nodded as he got up from the floor. And then the harpy stepped toward him and held out her hand. And, stumbling over her words, she managed to say that he was very reliable. The next second, she yanked him to his feet. Off to the side, Forte clicked his beak and apologized to Araya, explaining that Hearn only knew how to express himself that way. He always mangled everything. The harpy frowned menacingly, but said nothing. Araya sighed, casting one last glance at the priest, and muttered that he doesn't heal people. He was, after all, a dark healer, no matter how you looked at it. Then the trio headed for the exit. A short while later, at the black entrance to the west wing, Mr. Agito was sitting on the steps in front of closed door. He looked up, frowned, and muttered, "They're taking a long time." Araya stepped forward from the trio and, stumbling over his words, asked Mr. Agito, had he really abandoned the sweep of the facility halfway through? That couldn't be possible. Agito silently waved his hand and opened the closed door. There were soldiers lying in the hallway. Agito explained that he'd taken out everyone he'd come across. Araya's eyes widened in amazement, and he muttered that it was impressive. But to himself, he thought that Forte and Hearn had said it would take no more than 5 minutes. But it seemed even that was an underestimate. This was the true power of one of the best fighters in the demon realm. Agito nodded and said they needed to start their escape immediately before the heroes' squad arrived. Araya looked at Agito and asked, was the hero squad really such a formidable opponent, even in their current state? Agito was silent for a couple of seconds. Then he turned away and said that 2 minutes after the battle began, either he or the hero would be dead. Araya pursed his lips, frowned slightly, but said nothing. After that, Agito spread his leathery wings and said he had to warn him about one thing. He would take Kiwi Araya to the land of demons, but there would be those who would not be pleased to see him, and depending on the circumstances, he might find himself in danger. The dark healer nodded, indicating that he understood everything. To himself, he thought that he was a man who had even assisted in the torture. He hadn't expected his request for asylum to be accepted without question. Noticing the man frown, Agito stepped toward him, picked him up, and said with a slight smirk that they would protect him with all their might. Araya didn't have time to react, and Agito briefly ordered them to take off. The protagonist thought absently. How exactly were they going to protect him? Forte and Hearn obeyed the captain's orders without delay, and after a few flaps of their wings, all four rose into the air. Agito declared that it was time to go home, to the land of demons. Meanwhile, in the city of Burson on the northern border, Lieutenant Colonel Schwiesen shouted furiously, demanding how on earth it could have happened that they hadn't even managed to organize a pursuit and all the captured demons had escaped. Of the 45 soldiers of the kingdom guarding the facility, 10 had died, and the rest were either in critical condition or seriously wounded. Moreover, one of the 15 highest-ranking church hierarchs, St. Lucius Itania, had perished. Mentally, Yakov gritted his teeth. He had a pawn like the Dark Healer in his hands, and the day when he would receive comprehensive information about the number of commanders and the military might of the demon realm was very close. Just a little more, and the rank of colonel, a key role in intelligence. He had been so happy when the war began, and now his leave had been cut short, and meeting Ellie's parents was postponed once again. These thoughts filled him with rage. The young soldier standing before him, holding the report, stated that by the time the pursuit was organized, the fugitive's trail had gone cold. Yakov slammed his palms hard on the table and asked why they hadn't immediately requested reinforcements from the military base. The subordinate stood even straighter and, stumbling slightly over his words, began to explain that there were many critically wounded people inside the facility, so they had prioritized rescuing them, as there was a risk of losing them, and the decision had been made not to split the reinforcements into rescue and search teams. Schwiesen frowned even more and asked who had given them permission to act on their own and let the source of information slip away. And anyway, how had the Dark Healer managed to escape? He mentally replayed the events once more. No body had been found at the scene. Could he have made a deal with the demons? If so, the blame for his recruitment would fall squarely on the lieutenant colonel himself. That damn Dark Healer threw a wrench in his plans. Meanwhile, in the capital of the demon realm, the demonic city of Delmont, Araya sat on a sofa in the spacious hall of the demon lord's castle, located right in the center of the city, his arms folded across his chest as he stared into space. 5 days had already passed since their escape from Burson. They had managed to arrive safely. Was the escape truly a success? No, it wasn't that simple. It would only be considered complete after he received refugee status, so one could say it was only just beginning. He muttered aloud that he had been told to wait right here. Araya looked up at the glass ceiling and gazed at the sky above his head. Dark, almost black, despite it being noon, with lightning flashing incessantly, branching out across the clouds and fading away without touching the ground. There was no rain, only this ceaseless electric flickering, which every so often flooded the hall with a cold, bluish light. Araya muttered quietly, "Could this really be called a clear sky? And at noon, no less? I wonder how their laundry even dries in weather like this." He even began to miss the sun a little. Suddenly, Araya caught a rustling and a stirring behind him. He turned around, and he saw a girl with rabbit-like pointed ears and bright eyes, sitting in a small courtyard and playing with butterflies. Something strange lay on her lap, either a toy or a small animal. Araya took a few steps toward her, and stopped a short distance away. The girl introduced herself as Amurta, and, hugging the little animal, asked who this guy in front of her was. He dropped to one knee and introduced himself as well, thinking to himself, could she really be related to someone from a noble family? Even though she's just a child, I need to behave politely. Amurta got up from her knees, took a few steps toward him, nodded, and introduced the animal in her arms as Mayan. At first, Araya thought it was a stuffed toy. But no, its pupils reacted to the light, and its chest rose and fell with steady breaths. And then he exhaled excitedly, realizing that it was a monster. His admiration grew with every passing second. He had never seen anything like it, clearly an endemic species of the demon realm. The creature looked as if a cat had turned into a demon or a cat ghost had taken up residence in a pillow. What anatomy! He was particularly intrigued by the strange lump on its belly and the several scars surrounding it. Araya frowned slightly, but tried to look friendly and asked the young lady who this creature in her arms was. Amurta shook her hair, looked at the animal, and tears welled up in her eyes. She explained that once a month, a nasty lump appears somewhere on Mine's body. It's a disease, and every time they have to perform surgery to cut it out. Araya nodded mentally, realizing that it was a malignant tumor, and the patches on her body were the scars left by the surgical procedures. After removing the tumor, the wound is closed manually. Dark healing cannot be used here because it regenerates even the removed tissue. Still, it's strange that such outdated methods are used in the land of demons. A girl's voice snapped him out of his reverie. Amurta turned to Mr. Araya and muttered that since he was wearing a white coat, he must be a dark healer, and asked if he could cure Mine's illness. Araya's eyes widened, and he thought that such a question couldn't simply be answered with a yes. He asked for permission to conduct a brief examination and held out his hands. The girl was wary, but she still handed the monster over to the young man. The creature merely let out a soft whimper and curled up in a ball in his arms, showing no sign of distress. Araya widened his eyes, using magic, and immediately thought to himself, what on earth is this? He examined the animal from all sides. It became more and more lively with every movement, and it turned out to be truly fascinating. The experience he'd gained from examining countless monsters suggested to him that the creature in his hands was a sort of chimera, and that the malignant tumor had arisen from an unfortunate combination of traits from several original monsters. Araya had become a dark healer for the money, but he loved research just as much, and the fact that his knowledge was applicable even to new species of monsters genuinely delighted and intrigued him. After all, new methods expand the range of services in the future, and that is an exceptionally useful pursuit. He rolled up his sleeves, settled the creature more comfortably on his lap, and muttered that he would probably work on it for a bit. Then he mentally ran through the plan. The transplant healing technique he had used many times at the kingdom's clinic, which turned the affected area into a gel and caused the surrounding tissues to absorb it. He said aloud that it would be difficult to completely cure Mayan right now, and added to himself that the problem lay in the creature's chimeric nature. His standard protocols couldn't be applied directly here. Amurta frowned and asked tearfully, "So, you can't help her after all?" And she explained that the creature had neither a father nor a mother. They still hadn't been found, and that Mayan had become her first friend here, in the inner courtyard. Araya showed no reaction to these words and remained silent, focusing on the creature on his lap, while a white flame flared and pulsed before him. Amurta, encouraged by his silence, continued by saying that Mayan had really helped her cope with her loneliness, so she thought it would be nice if someone could help her too. Amurta's father had consulted many dark healers, but nothing had worked. The specialists here are very specialized. Each works with specific races like vampires or werewolves, and a creature as rare as Mayan is simply beyond their expertise. Araya periodically nodded and grunted in response, completely absorbed in his examination, until he finally said a little louder that this was very interesting, and so that's how everything works here. Hearing this exclamation, Amurta finally paid attention and realized that it seemed Mr. Araya hadn't been listening to her at all. Araya shook his head, looked at the girl, and asked her to be a little quieter, since he was concentrating right now. Amurta jumped up and asked furiously, "Didn't you really listen to me? I told you so much." Araya nodded and explained that he had simply been distracted by treating Mayan. He patted the creature and apologized. Then he handed the black and white creature back to its owner and explained that it was still difficult to completely prevent a recurrence, but he had already performed the procedure to remove the tumor, and in about 10 minutes the tumor would dissolve, absorbed by the surrounding tissues. Amurta picked Mayan up, raised her eyebrows in surprise, and asked, "How is that possible?" Araya realized that detailed explanations were unnecessary for the girl, and, put it more simply, surgery was no longer needed. He saw the child's eyes light up. The protagonist smiled slightly and added that if he took the time to develop a personalized treatment plan specifically for Mayan, he would be able to cure her completely. Just then, their conversation was interrupted by a loud voice addressing Mr. Kiwi Araya. It announced that everything was ready for the audience, that His Majesty the Demon Lord was waiting, and that the man was asked to proceed down the corridor. A wide platform appeared right in front of them. It led to massive double doors at the end of the hall. Araya nodded, walked across the platform, touched the door, turned to Amurta, and said he had things to do, but they would definitely meet up somewhere later. The girl clutched Mayan tighter and just mumbled something incoherently. Araya opened the doors and thought to himself that he needed to prove his worth. As soon as Araya stepped through the doors, he was blinded by a bright light. The doors behind him closed immediately, and he found himself in a huge hall. A loud voice rang out, welcoming him. Araya looked ahead and saw 10 demons kneeling, forming a passageway to a small pedestal on which a throne stood. The ruler sat on the throne, and next to him was an advisor, a girl with 6 wings. She flapped her wings and announced that before him stood the ruler of the demon realm, Ogron. His Majesty, the Lord of Demons, Romak Okron. All 10 rose from their knees at once and praised the Lord. Araya took a few steps forward, stopped, and dropped to one knee, bowing his head. And he told himself that for the sake of refugee status, he would do anything. Suddenly, a pleasant male voice rang out, and Romak asked him to raise his head. Then he smiled and said he was glad to see Mr. Araya. Introduced himself, he added that there was no need for formalities. They needed to have a casual conversation, noting that the man was still on his knees. Araya stood up and noted to himself that he had previously imagined the Demon Lord as a huge, burly man. Although, you can't judge by appearances, he had learned that lesson long ago. Romak continued, saying that first and foremost he wanted to express his gratitude for the fact that the protagonist had personally initiated the release of valuable commanders, Agito, Hearn, and Forte. Araya bowed his head again and muttered that it was a great honor. The Lord waved his hand and asked him to stop being so modest. After all, they say he is an outstanding dark healer, the likes of whom are rare even in the demonic kingdom, and the liberation of the 3 is entirely his doing. The Lord had also heard that the man wished to seek refuge in Ogron. Araya nodded. Romak waved his hand again and frowned slightly, explaining that many customs in Ogron differed greatly from those in the human kingdom. Araya raised his gaze slightly and mentally considered that the Lord was unlikely to be referring to such mundane things as the climate or the citizens' mentality. War is raging now, and no country would accept defectors from the enemy camp without a compelling reason. So Romak is actually testing him. Could Kiwi Araya truly become an enemy of the human kingdom? Araya explained that he was a dark healer, and healing dark creatures would always be his calling, no matter where he was. There would be no problems, and from now on he was ready to devote all his strength to serving His Majesty. And upon hearing an approving chuckle, he mentally noted that contact had been established. However, a short old man with a cane stepped forward and shouted that His Majesty must not be deceived, for after all, the dark healer was human, and who knew what treacherous schemes had brought him here. He must be executed immediately. Next, a demon in knight's armor with a flame in place of a head stepped out of the ranks and muttered that the possibility of espionage existed. After all, the kingdom had captured their southern city. The balance of power in the war clearly lay with the humans, and it would be more logical to side with the victor rather than flee to the losing side. Then Agito stepped forward. Frowning slightly, he said that, as they had discussed earlier, this argument would lead nowhere. Since there was no clear evidence, they should hear the protagonist's true intentions and only then determine his fate. Araya noted to himself that this had been discussed even before the audience, and Agito had stood up for him, for which he was deeply grateful. The old demon continued to shout, flames bursting from his mouth. He categorically disagreed, for once something happened, it would be too late. This man must be incinerated immediately. Romak waved his hand with the air of someone thoroughly fed up with the scene and ordered the old man to shut up. The next second, a zipper appeared where the old man's mouth had been. Romak apologized for his subject's rudeness. Araya replied that his suspicions were quite natural. The Lord nodded and explained that he was indebted to Araya and had not the slightest intention of harming him, especially since he had heard his true motives and was convinced of their sincerity. However, there was great resistance among the commanders. On one side are those in favor, on the other, those opposed. Silence fell. Suddenly, there was a loud creak. The doors swung open, and Amerta ran into the hall, shouting the word Dad at the top of her lungs. Araya froze in place, mentally asking himself what on earth Amerta was doing here at an official meeting. The girl ran up to Romak and, showing him her monster, shouted that Mayan was fine and that Dr. Araya had cured it. Romak smiled broadly and muttered that Daddy was so impressed. He scooped his daughter up into his arms and hugged her tightly. The Lord's advisor immediately whispered that His Majesty was busy with state affairs and should not be distracted. The news hit Araya almost physically. Amerta's father was the Lord of Demons. Meanwhile, Romak sat his daughter on his lap and asked with a smile if she had been bored while he was busy. The girl pressed Mayan closer to her face and happily announced that the sore was gone. The man nodded, looked at the animal, and repeated his daughter's words. And he looked down in surprise. She really had recovered after all. He felt a little calmer. Then Amerta pointed at the Dark Healer and said that he was the one who had cured her little friend. The Demon Lord spoke the protagonist's name, and he apologized for his daughter, since she had caused so much trouble. The protagonist shook his head and replied with a slight smile that, on the contrary, examining Mayan had been an invaluable experience for him. He added to himself that this might sound like a polite cliché, but he meant it sincerely. The knowledge gained from encountering new monsters is an asset that lasts a lifetime. Romak asked thoughtfully how he had managed to cure the tumor. After all, even the renowned dark healers have been unable to do so. Araya smiled and replied that he had run a clinic in the capital that specialized in treating monsters. Romak immediately spoke up. The fact that Araya had cured Mayan clearly demonstrated his extraordinary abilities. Admitting this man into the country as a refugee would be of immense benefit to the state. Of course, outstanding abilities are no proof that he isn't a spy, but this argument would lead nowhere. In that case, they should repay Mr. Araya for his kindness, and at the same time, secure a benefit for the country. That will be his choice. Seeing that there were no objections, Romak straightened up and solemnly proclaimed, in the name of the Lord of Demons, the recognition of Mr. Kiwi Araya as a refugee in the demon realm of Ogron. The protagonist bowed deeply, and he thanked His Majesty. Romak said he would provide him with a guest room in the castle, and he would immediately send a familiar to assist him in his daily life, and if anything troubled him, he could always turn to him. Araya nodded once more, and left the hall. Silence reigned for a moment. Then Romak turned to the old man and ordered him to speak plainly. The old man frowned and muttered that he didn't trust people. They were even more cunning and power-hungry than demons, and His Highness should know that. Romak nodded in agreement, for he already knew all this. The old man waved his cane and asked why the Lord had trusted him. Of course, there was currently a shortage of personnel in the land of demons, and due to the war, the number of wounded was growing, and even the castle's cleaners had to be reassigned to other tasks. He understood that this man was a dark healer and very valuable. But Romak frowned and asked grimly, who trusted whom? The old man was frightened, and Romak explained that when he said Kiwi Araya would be of benefit to the country, that was exactly what he meant. Whether Araya can be trusted and whether he is beneficial to the country of demons are entirely different questions. As a ruler, he is not inclined to trust just anyone, but he has no intention of making foolish decisions and turning away an outstanding specialist simply because he cannot trust him completely. The old man nodded and acknowledged that the decision was correct, but asked, what about keeping an untrustworthy person inside the castle, especially since he has already been in contact with Lady Amerta? The Lord replied that there was no problem. Mayan was there. The old man asked again, and Romak explained that if the Dark Healer had any evil intentions, Mayan would sense it, for she is capable of reading the hearts of those she touches, and if she sensed something amiss, she would eliminate the scoundrel. And he had specifically instructed a fellow alchemist to create this creature exactly that way. The old man nodded in agreement. Then the demon lord turned to his advisor, Esmeralda. She immediately dropped to one knee, ready to carry out his command. Romak ordered a familiar to be prepared for Araya, to accompany and assist her in the castle. The final choice was up to the girl herself. The girl nodded in agreement, and Romak added that he considered the main character to be the wind, one that would completely dispel the heavy atmosphere reigning in the land of demons. Then, looking away, he added quietly that if that happened, the situation that was currently unfolding might improve slightly. Esmeralda smiled and replied that she would be happy about that. A short while later, in the advisor's private chambers, the girl was surprised by Malphobia's arrival. A beautiful red-haired girl entered the chambers, pressed her hand to her chest, and announced that she had come dressed appropriately to fulfill her duties as a familiar. The outfit was more than revealing. The girl raised her eyebrows in surprise and asked, since they had called her specifically, did that mean there was another task besides her usual duties as a servant? The Lord's advisor nodded and said that starting tonight, Malphobia would become Kiwi Araya's familiar, and would give herself completely to him. The girl asked again, to wring him dry? Esmeralda shook her head and explained she needed to seduce him. With Milphobia's power, she would be able to make the guy drown in pleasure and make his body and soul her own. After all, she was a succubus. The girl nodded in agreement and muttered that there was no man who wouldn't drown in her, and that tonight she would make Araya her captive. Esmeralda nodded her away. As soon as the door closed behind Milphobia, the advisor exhaled heavily. She collapsed onto the large bed and stared at the ceiling. Then she muttered that she was very tired because she had to review the allocation of resources, then receive reports from her subordinates, and also keep the aristocrats in check, who were dissatisfied with the protracted war. The next second, she screamed loudly that she absolutely didn't want to work. She started rolling back and forth on the bed, and through her tears, she muttered that she wanted someone to take pity on her, hug her, and comfort her. Meanwhile, Araya found himself in the guest room, looked around, and muttered that it was truly luxurious. More spacious than his office in the capital. By the way, he had destroyed the unfinished research materials that had remained at the clinic. Those were titled On the Mutual Compatibility of Monsters and the Human Body. Walking over to the window, he recalled that by sacrificing his life force, he had proven that dark healing of a mythical level could be applied to demons and monsters. The mythical level refers to the resurrection magic used by certain special elves of the Western Kingdom. The effect is orders of magnitude different from the ordinary kind, and if he had published such findings in the kingdom, he would certainly have been lynched from all sides. Well, he's already emigrated, so it doesn't matter. There was a faint knock, but the guy didn't pay any attention and kept thinking if he sold this technology in the demon realm, he could make some decent money. Although no, he shouldn't. It's ethically unacceptable after all, and even he understands that. Besides, instead of a one-time payment, he'd like to create a system that would generate regular income. He could open the clinic again, but he'd have to figure out the location, how to attract clients, and, in some cases, the staff. If only a good idea would come to him. There was another knock. Araya absent-mindedly said the door was open and they could come in. Milphobia appeared in the doorway and closed the door behind her. She then introduced herself, saying that starting today, she would be his familiar. Araya nodded, held out his hand, and said he was pleased to meet her. The girl smiled, released her pheromones, and murmured that she, too, hoped to sincerely serve Araya in every way. In the capital of the human kingdom, Shuizhen addressed the assembly, reporting that the escaped demons and the Dark Healer had not yet been found, and the search is set to continue. Brigadier General Joseph Solfeggio thanked him for the report, and then he ordered the search to be called off. Folding his arms, he explained that further action was futile, that the operation should be scaled back, and that they should limit themselves to increasing surveillance around Eldon. Shuizhen jumped to his feet and shouted furiously, stumbling over his words. Were they really going to let the fugitives go free? The general calmly replied that they had long since crossed over into the land of demons, and searching for them in the vicinity of the kingdom was pointless. Their trail had long since gone cold. Hearing this, Yakov asked, "Where does this certainty come from?" Joseph silently placed the documents in front of him. Shuizhen began reading the headline about the mutual compatibility of monsters and the human body, the potential for dark healing on a mythical level, and asked in shock, "What on earth is this?" Joseph sat down and replied that they had found it during a search of the Kiwi Araya clinic, and he suggested that they first familiarize themselves with the materials. The more Yakov read, the worse he felt. The paper stated that by using human life force as fuel, one could achieve a mythical level of regeneration through dark healing. He shouted, "How is that even possible?" One of the other officers adjusted his glasses and remarked that, although it looked like a draft, the content constituted a quite serious scientific work, and it seemed as though the author had known in advance that he would be sent to treat demons. And all the dots connected into a clear line. Kiwi Araya hadn't been kidnapped by demons. On the contrary, he was the mastermind behind it all. Joseph smirked and asked, did the lieutenant colonel really think he was using Araya? But in reality, the protagonist had him wrapped around his finger. Shuizhen gritted his teeth and said that it was entirely his fault, offering his deepest apologies. In his mind, he thought that this was supposed to be his chance for a promotion, and now he would be branded a traitor to his country. He cursed that dark healer for all eternity. Joseph announced the order. Lieutenant Colonel Shuizhen was to serve on the front lines as a liaison officer between the garrison in the former demonic city of Eldon and intelligence. Yakov understood immediately. A liaison officer meant delivering letters and secret documents, a job for rookies. He had effectively been demoted, and yet the path to the rank of colonel had already been opened. Joseph added that even after the demonic commander's escape, the kingdom retained the upper hand in the war, and the general staff wanted to launch a follow-up strike before the situation changed. And he asked Shuizhen to gather all reports from the garrison in Eldon. Shuizhen nodded obediently and replied, that he would return to his roots and humbly accept this assignment. But Shuizhen realized that this sounded a bit too passive, and if he wants results, he simply needs to lay the groundwork for a victorious battle himself. Meanwhile, in the guest quarters of the demon castle, Milphobia licked her lips. Araya, meanwhile, wondered about her tongue, assuming it was simply a racial trait. The girl said he could consider her his loyal servant and command her to do whatever he wanted. The protagonist tried to refuse her help, but Milphobia declared that she had heard of his exploits. She stepped closer and said she wanted to express her gratitude by serving their bodies. The protagonist glanced at the familiar and was surprised. After all, the girl's skin texture and body temperature were roughly the same as his, and if you looked closely, her irises had a gradient of red hues, and a sweet, tropical scent of magic emanated from her entire body. He was curious about what race the girl belonged to, and he replied that she had really intrigued him. Milphobia noticed his gaze and asked if something about her was bothering him. Araya nodded and apologized. He knew it was a bad habit. Milphobia immediately cut him off and said that for a man, it was a perfectly healthy reaction, and she, too, wanted Mr. Araya to learn everything about her right away. Araya nearly jumped for joy in his mind. She actually wanted to tell him about her nature herself. That was incredibly cool. However, Milphobia added that it was still only evening and she didn't think it was the best time for heart-to-heart talks. Araya nodded and thought that. So, the girl had physical traits that depended on the time of day and muttered aloud that there was nothing to be done about it. He would wait patiently for the right moment. The protagonist sat down on the couch and looked thoughtfully at his familiar. Milphobia crossed her arms in front of her and said that if he was so concerned about her appearance, they could get right to it. Araya shook his head and replied that he didn't mind waiting until nightfall. He had a vivid imagination, and simply by watching the girl, he was quite capable of satisfying his curiosity. She jumped up and asked furiously, "How can you satisfy yourself just by watching? That sounds a little unhealthy. After all, it would be hard for him to relieve himself that way. There are other methods, for example, using his hands." Araya glanced at his hands and said that using his hands to let off steam was indeed a good method. There was a time when he simply wrote down all his ideas on paper. However, he overdid it once and has had tendinitis ever since, so now he refrains from doing so. Milphobia asked in surprise and clarified just how much had accumulated there. Araya looked at her and replied that his thoughts never stopped. You could say his reserves were inexhaustible. Once he started, he couldn't stop. Milphobia swallowed nervously and muttered under her breath that she needed to try it as soon as possible. No, she simply had to serve him properly. The protagonist asked again and declared that it was only evening now. At that very moment, Milphobia drew the curtains and announced with a smile that night had fallen. Araya raised his eyebrows in surprise and thought that this must be a physical trait that reacts to light, not the time of day. Milphobia said that, even if it wasn't immediately obvious, Mr. Araya was clearly aroused and began to take off her jacket. The protagonist looked at her and thought, could she have brought a stethoscope? Milphobia wrapped her arms around herself, and a mark began to glow on her stomach. Araya jumped up from his seat, his eyes wide open, and he realized she was a succubus. The girl shyly admitted that yes, she was her master's loyal servant, and he could do whatever he wanted with her. The next second, Araya waved his hand and grabbed the lamp from the table. He sat the girl down on the bed, announcing that they would start with an interrogation. Ignoring her surprise, he continued to ask, why is the mark of lust glowing right now? It hadn't glowed before, and he wanted to know the reason and the conditions under which it glowed. Noticing even greater bewilderment in the girl's eyes, the protagonist nodded and, drawing on his knowledge of succubi, surmised that the source of their energy was the life force of human men. But in the land of demons, such men are hard to find. So what does she usually eat? The girl explained that she eats regular food too. That's her main diet, and that human men are needed more for her brain than for her stomach. Araya nodded and muttered thoughtfully that, apparently, this was a luxury item, like tobacco and alcohol. Milphobia exclaimed indignantly and asked why. After such an atmosphere, the questioning had suddenly begun. The protagonist shrugged and replied that he simply wanted to get to know her as a species. The girl realized that her seduction wasn't working and muttered that this was the first time in her life this had happened to her. The next second, she wrapped her thighs around the main character. She pushed him onto the bed. She sat on top of him, then smiled when she noticed the man starting to breathe heavily and blushing, and she realized that he was finally reacting. The protagonist froze, recalling that he had read about this in ancient books on monsters, and he surmised that this was the very nectar pollen of succubi that weakens the human mind. Milphobia rose to her knees and replied that the mark had lit up because her body wanted to accept Master Araya's love. The man glanced once more at the flashing mark and realized that this was very valuable information. The next second, He furiously surmised that succubi's lust marks glow when aroused. Milphobia was taken aback and asked, "What's the difference?" And she began to unbuckle his belt. The protagonist surmised, once more, that it was roughly like tobacco or alcohol, and that in front of a human man, she lost self-control. The protagonist grew more and more excited. He was curious about everything, the conditions under which it flashed, and whether the mark glowed during self-pleasure. At this, the girl moved back slightly. She tensed up, muttering that the guy needed to calm down. Araya continued to interrogate her maniacally. He received a negative answer. He laughed and exhaled, so the trigger wasn't just arousal. Demons are so mysterious. Noticing that the girl was trying to leave, he immediately turned to her and asked where she was going. And then he continued, asking what happens if the partner is of the same sex, or if they aren't humanoid. Is there a difference between intimacy with romantic feelings and just physical contact? By the end of his speech, he was breathing heavily, almost gasping for air, and thought to himself that he was very tired. Milphobia, panicking, decided that her nectar of desire had gotten out of control. The next second, she fired a magical blast at the guy's chest and ordered him to fall asleep. He passed out and fell flat on his back. After a while, the protagonist opened his eyes, saw Milphobia, and greeted her. The girl immediately bowed deeply and mumbled that it was her fault, since she had confused him and put him under a hypnotic spell. As a sign of apology, she handed him the book Anatomy and Medicine of Succubi, based on life stories. The protagonist grabbed the book and smiled wildly, thanking her. Milphobia nodded and added that she had one more thing to tell him that morning. The protagonist was engrossed in the book, but wondered, could there really already be a job in the land of demons where he could help? He would gladly agree. He currently had no experience in these parts, and he definitely needed to build up a work history. But Milphobia said that starting today, he was forbidden to leave this room. She pulled back the curtain, revealing the courtyard, and explained, the Demon Lord's castle is under zombie attack, and if he goes out, he'll be eaten. Araya immediately jumped up and asked again. Milphobia nodded and said that it was the absolute truth and that he could look out the window. The guy immediately rushed to the window, and upon seeing the scene, he frowned and asked, "Are those zombies?" Something wasn't right here. Zombies are the living dead, but why do all of these look like human corpses? They're in the land of demons. Shouldn't these be demonic? Milphobia explained that ordinary zombies in their country are resurrected naturally due to the clouding of magic, and the reanimated dead are extremely rare. The Dark Healer asked again, "Naturally? What does that mean?" The concept of magic corruption was unfamiliar to him, so he asked her to explain. The girl explained that this phenomenon is also called miasma. These arise from poor mental hygiene and harm even demons. Noticing his confusion, she put it more simply, because of stress. Now, with wars raging in the West, demons are actively emitting negative magic, which accumulates in poorly cleaned areas, turning into miasmas, from which zombies then emerge like mushrooms. Araya muttered that it was just like mold, but why then in human form? Milphobia frowned and replied that the process hasn't been studied in detail, but there's a theory. Zombies adapt their appearance to their surroundings. Here, in the Demon Lord's castle, most of the inhabitants have a human-like appearance. It's their common trait. In the forests, for example, you often encounter zombies moving on all fours. The protagonist frowned slightly and thought, if these attack the living just like ordinary undead, then they must at least have a brain giving commands. And he muttered aloud that these reproduce on their own, have brains, and are capable of simple actions. In his mind, he was already getting carried away. If he could use dark healing to tweak part of their brains and eliminate the aggression defect, perhaps he could set up mass production of an ideal, cheap labor force. Wasn't this a tremendous business opportunity? Seeing how excited the Dark Healer had become, Milphobia warned him. No matter how interested he might be in the nature of zombies, the protagonist must not leave the room under any circumstances. Zombies don't possess great strength, but they know no fear and feel no pain. They'll attack without hesitation, and if things go wrong, they'll just eat you. Araya nodded and muttered that he already knew all that. Milphobia said that if he needed anything, he could come to her. The protagonist nodded and thanked her. The girl asked him once again not to go outside on his own under any circumstances. She repeated this several times, and Araya, frowning slightly, assumed she simply didn't trust him. The girl explained that she was just worried that someone might take an interest in the nature of zombies and conduct a medical survey on them, just like she had. Araya spread his arms and shook his head. Even if he wanted to, he wouldn't be able to conduct a zombie survey. After all, they can't even speak. Milphobia nodded, exhaled, and apologized. Then she turned around and said she'd go now, but would stop by around noon to bring him lunch. The protagonist thanked her and asked her to be careful. After a while, making sure Milphobia had left, the guy walked out the door. and he muttered that even if he couldn't conduct a zombie survey, he was quite capable of performing a one-sided inspection, and he could already smell the scent of money. He made his way through the castle's corridors until he found himself in some barricaded room. Exhaling heavily, he admitted that things hadn't gone according to plan. Who knew that as soon as he stepped outside, a whole crowd of zombies would start trailing after him? Since they gather in groups, so organized, maybe they have a social structure? The zombies didn't answer, only groaned and reached out their hands toward him. The protagonist was tired of sitting there and suffering. He looked around and found a solution. He tied together several sheets and towels and lowered them out the window. And he climbed down. As he ran down the street, he muttered to himself that this time he had to be more careful so that no one would notice. Suddenly, a child's voice called his name. Amerta was sitting on the roof of a small building that looked like a shed. The boy looked up and asked in surprise what she was doing there. The girl asked for help and told him there were zombies downstairs. The protagonist sighed heavily and asked, "Is it really safe to wander around alone?" After all, it was dangerous. Amerta began to cry harder. She had just wanted to go for a walk, but then a bunch of zombies suddenly appeared, and she couldn't get back. Araya nodded and asked how many zombies were on her side, and seeing one finger, he asked the girl to sit quietly where she was. Carefully, the protagonist stepped out from behind the wall and took off his shirt as he moved. The girl tried to warn him, but Araya had the situation under control. The monster fell. The protagonist burst out laughing and thought this was a great opportunity. He threw his white coat over the zombie's head, and when the girl asked if everything was okay, he replied that everything was just fine and asked her to wait a little longer. And he told her he would try to neutralize this zombie. Araya gave a grim smile as he began to cast dark healing. He wanted to poke around in the zombie's brain using magic. And since he had this chance before neutralizing it, he would briefly, just briefly, distract himself from his original goal. He continued to strip away the skeleton and muscles. Everything was exactly like a human's. The spinal cord, neural connections, everything was in place, even the genitals. It was like a divine clay sculpture. If he could control the electrical signals in the brain and force it to perform any necessary actions, then mass production of cheap labor would be entirely feasible. So, immediately, he set about studying the structure of the brain. Suddenly, a woman's voice called the guy by name. It was Hearn. She shouted the names of her recent savior and Ms. Amerta and asked what on earth they were doing there. Hearn asked what Araya was thinking. After all, they were zombies, and if they were under attack, he should have said so right away. She flapped her wings, ordered him to step back, and announced that she would finish it off with a single blow. The protagonist sighed and muttered that this was different, and he explained that he was conducting a medical examination. A little while later, Milphobia put her hands on her hips and reminded him that she'd told him not to leave the room and had warned him about the danger. Araya innocently remarked that he had his reasons. Milphobia nearly screamed and asked what possible reasons there could be for returning looking like a cat that had been caught. Just then, Hearn appeared in the doorway and explained that she had been looking for Mistress Amerta and had seen Araya sitting astride a zombie. Milphobia thanked her and said she couldn't even bear to imagine what he would have been up to if they hadn't found him. The protagonist thought to himself that he would have been giving her a medical exam. Hearn sat down in a chair and asked why Milphobia was there. After all, a succubus in a human's room is like a fox in a henhouse. Milphobia sternly asked her not to mention the Dark Healer by name, since he was a savior and an honored guest. Hearn shrugged and explained that they had become friends on their way to the land of demons. The protagonist nodded. Milphobia asked if His Majesty hadn't given Hearn time off. She then asked why she was working. Hearn closed her eyes and replied that she wasn't a wimp, and besides, Araya had used dark healing on the guys. Suddenly it dawned on her. Was the succubus really going to milk Araya dry? Milphobia, blushing, said that was rude and that she had been officially appointed as a familiar. Hearn laughed and asked whose devious plan was this. After all, it was obvious that the fox would eat the chicken. She rose from her chair and said that, knowing the succubus, she was surely waiting for a convenient opportunity. Noticing Milphobia's smile, the harpy continued, saying she'd known all along that Milphobia was dangerous and that they needed to change familiars immediately. Araya thanked Hearn for her concern, but said she needn't worry. Physiologically, he was immune to temptation. To himself, he thought that he had never experienced particularly strong sexual desire, and assumed it was due to dissonance, since he was a person belonging to the holy phase yet possessed dark magic. Of course, that's what he thinks, but it's just a hypothesis. Although there's a possibility that he's simply much more interested in researching dark healing and making a fortune. Hearn muttered that Milphobia was an outstanding succubus. She walked over and whispered something in her friend's ear. Hearn sat up and asked how the nectar pollen hadn't worked. Milphobia suggested she check for herself. Hearn blushed, but sat down next to the protagonist. Blushing, she asked him to do whatever he wanted with her. Araya's eyes widened, and he smoothed her hair, the ends of which had feathers. Noticing a fallen feather, he yanked it out sharply. Hearn gasped. After all, she had expected him to be interested in something more substantial. The protagonist sighed and remarked that the feather was smooth, beautiful, fluffy, stored magic, and smelled pleasant, and that it was very interesting. Outraged, Hearn snatched the feather and asked if he really had no tact at all. Mulphobia whispered that that was exactly what she meant. Hearn said aloud, "We shouldn't be worried about Araya, but about the succubus. After all, she might snap from frustration." Mulphobia replied that she had sworn never to take anyone by force, and she apologized to the gentleman for her friend. She speaks her mind to those she trusts. Araya nodded, noticing that the girls got along perfectly. Mulphobia explained that they both reported to higher-ups, so they saw each other often. Seeing how the protagonist picked up the book and calmly sat down to read, Mulphobia said fiercely that the conversation wasn't over. As for leaving without asking, he wouldn't do that again, would he? The frightened protagonist nodded. Then Mulphobia asked, what if rare Tsukinoko-shaped zombies appeared outside the window? And, seeing how he began to look around frantically, she realized that only a day had passed, and she had already gotten to know the gentleman's nature quite well. She took a chair, placed it by the exit, and said that until the commotion subsided, she would have to keep a close eye on him. The protagonist must be patient until the zombies are cleared out. Otherwise, it will be a loss for the entire country. Meanwhile, in the dungeon beneath the castle, a sad voice asked, "How much time has passed?" A skeleton in a dark robe on the throne ordered the zombie servants who had come into contact with a living person to come before him. There were 3 of them, a zombie soldier, a zombie thief, and a zombie queen. He ordered them to kidnap a person from the demon lord's castle tonight, a living person, and under no circumstances to kill them. The skeleton laughed, for he knew that the day had come when he could once again turn living people into zombies. The skeleton continued, "The living are here, and it didn't matter if they had been brave warriors in life, like him. If their bodies belong to the light phase and possess holy power, that is not a problem." He ordered his servants to rejoice. They would gain brothers and sisters from among the former humans. Everything is going according to plan. The invasion of the cursed land of demons and his grand scheme to destroy the world had come one step closer. In his room, the protagonist lay on the bed and pondered. If he could set up mass production of zombies, he could secure a supply of organs for transplantation. Mulphobia sighed heavily and realized that the protagonist was thinking only of zombies. After all, that's how they'll appear in his nightmares. Araya replied that if he could study them even in his sleep, he would do just that. After all, it doesn't cost a thing. Then he asked, she wasn't seriously planning to spend the night here and keep watch over him, was she? She nodded, and she said she would sleep on the floor by the door, and she couldn't jump out the window. They were on the 3rd floor. The protagonist frowned and said that sleeping on the floor was bad for you. The girl smiled and replied that it wouldn't affect her work. The protagonist said he'd worry about her. Mulphobia replied that in that case, she could lie down with him. The guy didn't object. Mulphobia moved closer and muttered that she hadn't expected an invitation. But when she heard that he would sleep quietly and wouldn't make a move on her, she was disappointed. At 3 in the morning, Araya woke up to find himself being held by several hands. He was lying in the arms of a zombie warrior. Next to him, a zombie thief was holding Mulphobia, who was tied up. The girl screamed in panic, saying she thought her master preferred specific games involving tying up sleeping people, which is why she'd been lying still and wondered where the zombies in this room had come from. The zombie queen was standing by the window. Then she jumped out. Her subordinates followed her, carrying the captives. The protagonist realized that these zombies were quite high level and couldn't even be compared to those that had appeared naturally. He surmised that these 3 had been created from real human bodies. He placed his hand on the kidnapper's chest, using dark healing, and he noticed that the density of their muscles was incomparably higher than that of ordinary zombies. In life, these had been warriors. In a part of the brain, he noticed a cluster of distorted magic, and he couldn't figure out what kind of magic it was. He surmised that this was the cause of the strange behavior. The zombie warrior remained silent. A short while later, the zombie queen swung her sword, and a glow appeared. Araya recognized it. This is how the paladins of the royal army glow, and this glow drives away evil within a certain radius. The holy warriors had become zombies, and he couldn't understand what must have happened for things to come to this. Then they continued on through the dark alleys. An unfamiliar voice praised his companions and asked them to be extremely careful. They approached the entrance to the dungeon, and they descended the steps into the depths for a long time. The protagonist tried to figure out whose voice it was. It was unlikely to be anyone from the Lord's castle. After all, no one would risk going against the Lord's will right under his nose. Suddenly, the zombie warrior froze. The dark healing was complete. One was ready. The protagonist realized that it was all due to a cluster of distorted magic that controlled the creatures. and neutralizing magic with magic is not a difficult task. However, this time he had to work hard, as if untangling a tight ball of thread. At the same time, he suppressed his captor's appetite, since he really didn't want to be eaten right then. Then the zombie thief was disarmed. Milphobia fell, freed herself from the ropes, and thanked him. Araya apologized for taking so long. The protagonist glanced at the zombie queen and would have loved to examine her brain. But he turned to Milphobia and said that safety was the priority now and they needed to retreat. Suddenly, the zombie queen approached and grabbed him by the shoulder, muttering something unintelligible. The protagonist realized that his master's order was still in effect and that she would prevent them from leaving. But since that was the case, there was nothing to be done, and he would examine the zombie queen's brain. Milphobia asked why he looked a little happy, even in a situation like this. Araya placed his hand on the zombie queen's cheek. He saw that this one had more distorted magic than the previous ones, and the brainwave patterns were somehow strange. They were darting up and down like water, sometimes boiling, sometimes icy. Milphobia looked around and asked if they were really in an unexplored dungeon. The protagonist said it would take some time. Milphobia suggested using them as guards until they reached the exit. Araya sighed and replied that it was impossible. He had tried, but he couldn't take control of the zombies' brains. Milphobia realized that there were things even a dark healer wasn't capable of. The protagonist replied, "Of course, and there are plenty of them. Besides, when it comes to the brain, it's all a blank slate." And he was once again convinced that generating electrical signals with specific commands was the realm of a creator. The most he was capable of was completely blocking the flow of signals. Consequently, his idea of using zombies as laborers was still difficult to implement, and he had already hoped this was a great business opportunity. He withdrew his hand, having finished his examination. Then he chuckled and asked the girl if she was upset about something. To be continued. Thanks for watching. Write your feedback in the comments. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. See you soon.